Throughout this course, we have reviewed several theories or models of practice. Many of these models and theoretical approaches are amenable to a variety of diagnoses, such as pediatric development, hand injury, brain injury, stroke, spinal cord injury, and aging. Back in week 8, I introduced what I refer to as the neuroscience model, which is also applicable to various diagnoses. This model helps us with a basic understanding of how motor learning and motor behavior develops due to the process of motor control, which is comprised of the feed-forward and feedback systems of the sensory motor processes of the human nervous system. This knowledge is integral to therapy, related to any diagnosis affecting the various aspects of the sensory motor system. As I have learned from presenting this information to thousands of occupational and physical therapy students, though I have simplified the concept of motor control, it still requires at least 2 course meetings to understand it. This lesson will again look at the processes of motor control, which I introduced previously, to enhance understanding. As you watch this YouTube video, remember that you can pause at any time and also go back to review a portion as desired. Though I have covered the basic concepts and differences between motor learning, motor behavior, and motor control on 2 previous occasions, there was still some confusion in answering this question in the mid-semester exam, though I gave a full credit to all responses. Therefore, I will quickly review each of these concepts. Motor learning is basically the process of learning a new skill. A good example of this is when you first learn to ride a bike. This may take a while, which is dependent to some degree on the teaching process. For example, you may have learned to ride a bike by using training wheels, or you may have learned to ride a bike by having someone initially walk along with you and hold on to the back of the seat as you learn to gain control and balance. Motor behavior refers to the specific way that you carry out a motor task. This varies widely between individuals, and a good example is handwriting. Though we each have the ability to write, we all write differently, which starts with how you hold the writing utensil. Therefore, handwriting is different among all of us, though we are all accomplishing the same motor task. Motor behavior often changes as a result of an injury, disease, or aging. Motor control is referring to the sensory motor processes occurring within the nervous system as a motor task occurs. This is the microsecond activity occurring within the nervous system to assist us in planning, execution, and coordination of motor tasks. The feed-forward system is a means of being in a ready state and developing a plan for a motor activity to then send signals to the appropriate muscles to carry out the activity. The quality of the motor activity, of course, will be dependent on the amount of motor learning that has occurred. In fact, if it is an activity we've done many times, then we have an established movement pattern that we can use, and the feed-forward system becomes less important unless we want to make changes to that movement pattern. The 3 areas involved in the feed-forward system are the basal ganglia, premotor area, and primary motor cortex. The basal ganglia works to keep us in a ready state to do a motor activity. Examples of problems with this center are Parkinson's disease and cerebral palsy. In both cases, there are unwanted movements when at rest, which also interfere with movement. In Parkinson's disease, individuals have resting tremors, which means the tremors are present even at rest. This is opposed to intention tremors, which are present as someone engages in movement and is indicative of a cerebellar disorder. In cerebral palsy, there are unwanted movements during both rest and activity. The premotor area is responsible for motor planning, which is referred to as praxis. Deficits in motor planning result in dyspraxia, or deficits in motor planning. When the basal ganglia keep you ready for movement and the premotor area is working well to plan the movement, the primary motor cortex sends signals via the cortical spinal tract to neurons in the spinal cord to direct muscle contraction and therefore movement. The feedback system consists of several neuronal pathways which will be discussed, and the primary function is to coordinate the movement. As we develop certain patterns of movement due to continued practice, the feedback system becomes less important for those activities, such as walking. The components of the feedback system will be presented in detail in the following slides. This is a schematic drawing of the components of the brain which will be used to show the myriad of pathways involved in the motor control process. As needed, you can access this drawing as the next item after the Week 12 module in the course in Canvas. After the feed-forward system has done its job, the neuronal signals from the primary motor cortex go down to spinal levels to facilitate the appropriate lower motor neurons, which activate the muscles for the desired movement. This pathway is called the cortical spinal tract, as it reaches from the cerebral cortex down to spinal levels. It is also referred to as the tract containing the upper motor neurons, as it originates in the brain as opposed to lower motor neurons, which arise in the spinal cord. Note that this pathway primarily crosses over the midline at the level of the medulla, emphasizing the importance of the right cerebral hemisphere in controlling movement on the left side of the body, and the left cerebral hemisphere controlling movement on the right side of the body. Therefore, motor influence of the cerebral hemispheres is primarily contralateral, or opposite side. Now, we need to coordinate the movement or make slight corrections to improve the movement. This is the function of the cerebellum. As you will see, cerebellar influence is ipsilateral or same side, in that the right cerebellar hemisphere helps to coordinate movement on the right side of the body, while the left cerebellar hemisphere helps to coordinate movement on the left side of the body. In order for the cerebellum to coordinate movement, it needs to know two things. It needs to know what specific movements were planned to complete the motor activity, and also it needs feedback from the muscles which were activated in order to know how the motor activity is happening. It then needs to compare what was planned with what is happening, and then assists in making changes to the movements in order to better coordinate the motor act. This slide depicts how the cerebellum gets information as to how the activity was planned. It gets this information from two sources. One source is from collateral fibers of the cortical spinal tracts, which arise in the pons and cross over to enter the cerebellar hemisphere on the opposite side. The other source is from a separate two-neuron system consisting of the cortical pontine tracts from the primary cortex region to the pons, and then connects with the pontocerebellar fibers which cross over into the cerebellar hemisphere on the opposite side. Now the cerebellum needs to know what movement is actually occurring. This occurs due to two sensory feedback systems. One is the spinocerebellar tract, which carries back sensory information regarding muscle movement and joint pressures to the cerebellar hemisphere on the same side. The other is an even more exacting feedback, which not only goes to the cerebellar hemisphere, but also crosses over in the medulla to go up to the thalamus and on to the cerebral cortex to give us conscious awareness of muscle activity and joint receptor information. This is why if I ask a room full of seated people to close their eyes and then raise their hand if their feet or legs are crossed, they are able to do so without having to open their eyes. This pathway system is due to input from muscles and joints via the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus neurons, entering the spinal cord and traveling up to the level of the medulla on the same side. The reason there are two different pathways is that there are so many of these neurons that the body separates itself, and the neurons of the fasciculus gracilis come from the lower extremities and lower trunk region, while the neurons of the fasciculus cuneatus come from the upper extremities and cervical region of the spinal cord. These pathways converge and synapse in the medulla on a pathway that splits in two and sends fibers into the cerebellar hemisphere on the same side, and also sends fibers across the midline to travel up to the thalamus and on to the cerebral cortex for conscious awareness of movement. The pathway from the medulla to the thalamus is referred to as the medial lemniscus, and the pathway from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex is referred to as the thalamocortical pathway. Now, the cerebellum has information about what was planned to occur, along with information about what is actually happening. If these two types of information agree with each other, then nothing needs to be done, as is the case with a well-learned activity such as walking. If, however, it is a new motor activity we are trying to learn, such as juggling, then there will be discordance between what the cerebellum knows was planned and what is happening, and the cerebellum will assist to correct the movements. This need for improvement is sent to the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum, and it then sends messages to correct the movement to the red nucleus in the midbrain on the opposite side of the midline via the dentatorubral tract. To help to correct the movement, the red nucleus then sends messages down to the lower motor neurons to help adjust muscle activity to improve coordination. This pathway begins in the red nucleus and needs to cross back over to the other side in order to travel down to influence lower motor neurons to improve the motor activity. Again, pointing out that though cerebral influence is primarily contralateral or opposite side, cerebellar influence to assist with coordination is ipsilateral or same side. Information is then sent from the red nucleus up to the thalamus via the rubro-thalamic tract and onto the thalamocortical tract on the opposite side from the cerebellum to let the brain know exactly what it had to do in terms of making corrections so that you can learn from the problems. Again, is shown the basic diagram used in order to draw in the neurons responsible for movement and its coordination. This diagram is available in the course in Canvas and is located just below the Week 12 module containing the access to this YouTube video lecture. The module is entitled Motor Control Drawing. You may want to print this diagram in order to practice your understanding by drawing in the pathways that have been described. This slide shows all of the pathways previously described and included and labeled in the diagram for you to review as a total picture. On the next slide is a text explanation you can use to match to this diagram to help in your understanding. This diagram, along with a text explanation, is available in a handout also found in Canvas following the Motor Control Drawing module and in a model entitled Motor Control Drawing and Text Explanation. You can then download and print these two pages in order to use for study purposes. This is the text used to explain the parts in the drawing on the previous slide. You may want to pause the video at this time in order to read this information. Keep in mind, you can print this information from Canvas at any time so that you will have it to be able to review at your leisure. Finally, this is a listing of the information you need to study, as there will be specific questions regarding the feed-forward and feedback systems on the final exam. You may want to pause the video at this time in order to review this information. Keep in mind, this review is also available as a module in Canvas entitled Motor Control Final Exam Review, so you can download and print it as desired.